All right, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. So, okay. Sorry. What's going on? Okay. So today we're going to talk about a really, really interesting topic. I always say that, but I mean it. This one is especially good. I don't know. I don't know. It's really fascinating though, and I think I'm a snob. I'm an intellectual snob. I think a lot of topics I'm just like very disappointed about how people treat them, how people think about them, the books that exist about them. And this is one of them. This is one case where I'm gonna, be intellectually snob and say the treatment that this subject will receive in this video is far superior than anything you will find on this topic. Seriously though, I do think I have like something interesting to offer, which is I'm gonna talk about subagents and subagentic dynamics within people, kind of like thinking of people as collections of agents rather than thinking of them as, kind of like unified egos, as it were, with kind of like coherent long-term goals and desires and perspectives. And instead, think of that as really kind of like an emergent effect of lots of subagents kind of coordinating with each other and like, pretending to be one. Is a topic with a lot of subtlety. I would say it's very complex, and again, I am broadly quite disappointed with what I have seen. There might be some authors or articles or videos that talk about this in a more nuanced way, but I haven't found it. Instead, the sort of things that we do find are things like internal family systems, um, and like various kind of like psychologizations of like the primal desires that people have, and kind of like trying to mediate them, and maybe the ego as kind of like an interface for those. We're going to go so much deeper in a way that I think is hopefully very insightful, and in particular that has like explanatory power for something that we're going to build towards, not go very deep in this, on this particular video, maybe in future videos, which is how this affects, for example, like the DMT entities that we experience, or the 5-MeO DMT kind of superintelligence or sense of superintelligence, and even actually kind of like political theory, like practical political theory at the level of humans, a topic about which I'm also probably very disappointed on. I think like most political theory is just not a non-starter, for the most part. Actually, most political theory, as far as I can tell, is itself built for the sake of politics. It's very, very hard to find kind of like neutral political theory from a political perspective, and usually they're just a mixture of false things as well as like underfitted, just like it's too simple. These models are too simple. Okay, so but before I go there, the quality of the day is going to be this like eclectic combination of Versace Eros, which I really like because it's kind of like something that is a lot of ambroxan, actually. Very beautiful molecule, but also interesting. It's a fougere, supposedly, and but what I really like about it actually is like it has like some mint in it, which is like very refreshing. And then the other thing I'm gonna be drinking throughout this conversation is, I went to Napa today for maybe a high stakes introductory meeting. We'll see. Most of the things of this nature are kind of like throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. I'm not gonna talk any details, but like there were like some really interesting conversations today, and like hopefully something will come out of that, from the point of view of QRI projects. But I went to Napa, and so decided to stop by and like try like non-alcoholic wines. I got this one, a Cabernet Sauvignon, alcohol free. It's not truly alcohol free; it's like 0.2%. But I liked it quite a bit. This one in particular is quite astringent. I mean, it tastes like wine without alcohol. Um, I'm not very good at describing wines. But yeah, it's kind of like an astringent uh, grape grape juice. That's like such a shallow description. Okay. I'll see if one of my culinary subagents can come up with something as we talk about all of these. Hmm. But it definitely makes me feel elegant. Very much so. Okay, so this is a complicated topic. I do think is worth your while. In particular, if you're about to go on a meditation retreat, or if you already planned on kind of like taking a psychedelic, especially of the more kind of like intellectual, intellectually engaging type, like LSD or mescaline or 2CB, that have kind of like some dopaminergic component, and it's not going to completely blast you off. Something that will allow you to kind of like actually think through ideas and see some of the effects that I'm going to be describing. Actually, like watching this video before one of those trips might be a really interesting choice, because it may allow you potentially, I'd be curious if this works, to harmonize at a deeper level than just reading about like neural annealing, for example. This is several levels deeper in a sense. So the first thing that I want to talk about is kind of like the naive conception of subagents inside us, which is kind of like a bag of bags. And it's kind of like a set theoretic conception of subagents, right? So typically, people might think of like, okay, sure, like this is yourself, the big picture of who you are. And then, okay, like there might be subcomponents inside you, maybe like organs and, various like neural modules. And then those are made of like, smaller subcomponents, which themselves are made of smaller subcomponents, and so on and so forth. I think, I mean, in some sense, this is like better than nothing to think about, what you are and who you are, but it doesn't go that far, because there's a lot of other rich detail when it comes to like actually how we're put together, that makes this picture actually quite naive. I mean, I think like this picture can be helpful as kind of like a way of thinking about subagents, in a way that actually can help your own subagents kind of like think about themselves and think about their collective. But because it does have like some significant details wrong, is kind of like a deceptively simple. And I don't think it is like that. Hmm. In a sense, one of the first things that I want to address is this concept of kind of like fractality. Um, in particular, the common, colloquial common sense notion of fractals, which is usually refers to like self-similarity. Like the object looks the same at different scales. And I think like when it comes to subagents, when it comes to like, the human body and biological organisms, there is usually some level of self-similarity across the scales. But, it's obviously not an infinite fractal. It doesn't go all the way down or all the way up, of course, either. But the difference is like more than that. Actually, the geometry, the topology of the system may change as a function of the scale at which you're analyzing it. And one of the kind of like key visualizations and discussions about this is, you can find in an article that I wrote in 2020, actually, when the coronavirus situation was evolving, where I discussed how some graph theoretical concepts about what I call scale-specific network geometry may impact policy when it comes to how to prevent the spread of something that is very contagious. Um, and what I want to say in particular now is that there are a lot of networks, definitely at the level of society, but I think also inside us, that are not self-similar, but where kind of like the concept that there are interactions across scales still matters a lot. Okay, so one super simple example here is kind of like a network that at the very, very small scale is actually linear. Like if you're like in one node in that network and you start to kind of like go to other nodes that are connected to it, there's going to be a while you're going to kind of like be walking in a line. Um, and I'll show you in a second kind of like what I mean by this. Something like this, where like actually the lines are made of like smaller nodes. Yeah, right. So this is like not self-similar, right? Like if you're kind of like in a node here and you start like walking and moving, um, the number of nodes that you can reach, just grows literally linearly, as a function of like the steps that you're allowed to take. Um, you take 5 steps and you can reach only 5 nodes. But then there's a critical moment where you reach kind of like one of these like connector vertices. Oh, and then now you can actually go to like many other ones. And so if you can kind of like think of like extending this system, there might be kind of like a scale at which you don't really see the lines anymore. You just see kind of like these like polygons. Again, like as a microbe, you may think like, oh, I'm stuck in a line. But maybe as an ant, something much larger, you will say like, no, this is a polygonal space, and it's kind of like two-dimensional, right? So like something that at a certain scale may look like one-dimensional, and another scale may be two-dimensional. And actually, if let's say like you continue to kind of like feel this out, but you actually kind of like add more detail as you kind of like move away from the center. Something that may happen is that at a even bigger scale, this actually looks like, for example, kale. This is not actually just it's kind of like the crevices in a kale in a leaf in what's called a hyperbolic curvature. And so here you would find that like, okay, like as you start moving around at the beginning, the nodes that are reachable grows like linearly. Then at some point, as you start to access these kind of connector nodes, it starts to become quadratic, x to the second power. And then at some other scale, once you kind of like zoom out far enough, it actually starts to become exponential because of the hyperbolic curvature. The area that you can cover as a function of the radius may grow kind of like r to, sorry, a constant to the r, to the distance. So that, ladies and gentlemen, and and whoever else, any other subagent composition, it is scale-specific network geometry. And, that is important because at different scales, we may have different geometry. Like entities at different scales may perceive themselves as inhabiting fundamentally different worlds with fundamentally different kind of like distance functions or growing functions relative to their environment. Okay, so that is, what I might call kind of like the basic setup, that we're not talking about something that is quite self-similar, even though there might be similarities across scales. The point is not that you're kind of like this like fractal of subagents. There's something more interesting and far more nuanced happening here. Maybe also think about it as like, there's like some things that do kind of like repeat to some extent up to a certain scale, but then they break down. Like trees actually are a good example. Like some of coniferous trees, for example, they look very fractal, but then you go to the lowest level and it's like, okay, just like a needle, for example, a needle leaf. And then it breaks down, right? Like there's no further levels. And then it's, it's a line. And then you zoom even further, it's a plane, right? And then if you zoom even further, it's actually a volume, right? So the geometry keeps changing as a function of how you approach it. Okay, the second very important thing is, I wrote an article in Quality Computing. This is actually very important. It's a relatively recent insight from last year, which I call costs of embodiment. This actually has become one of kind of the canonical QRI arguments for why digital computers are unlikely to be conscious. Again, this is a complex, nuanced topic, and I could make an hour-long, 2-hour-long video just about costs of embodiment. However, I do think it is important for me to cover some of the basics for this particular video. And it goes as follows. You see, when you build a digital computer, how we have done it as a society, to a large extent, we are offering them the eyes and the hands and kind of the maintenance costs. We put them together and we can see how the different pieces are connected to each other. And we do that in advance, of constructing them. I mean, in some sense, computer systems, digital computer systems, kind of like embody our own embodiment, right? They're kind of like, they're borrowing from our visual field, from our tactile field, from our capacity to reason counterfactuals and visualize geometric spaces. They cannot assemble themselves. I mean, it doesn't mean that they won't be able to in the future. And I very much expect that with the advancement of AIs, maybe even within a few years, if not a decade, um, yes, like digital systems will be able to kind of like maintain themselves. If you have like enough drones and cameras and sensors and access to primary, resources, and ability to process those resources, you cross a threshold where, to quote John C. Lilly, you enter into a possible arrangement of matter and energy that might be described as like solid state intelligence, where effectively, these computer architectures can, maintain themselves. They can see in what ways they're broken, and they have like enough of kind of like slack that the whole society of robots, and AIs are able to, self-sustain. We're not there yet. But importantly, the way in which these systems are designed really are not designed for that, right? Like, the like the internet and complex systems and the electric grid and so on, they break down all the time. I mean, it's humans who are constantly battling against this energy, and they do it with, their visual fields and their tactile fields, auditory fields, their cognitions and counterfactuals, etc. All of that is borrowed from us, right? Like, the systems are not yet intelligent enough to do it, and even if they're intelligent, they're just kind of like a fundamentally different type of system, as opposed to a biological system where, think about this. There are enormous, enormous hurdles to be able to create something like a human, right? You need to self organize, trillions of cells for them to figure out where they are in the organism to differentiate and know, hey, am I an eye? I'm a, a tail, or like, am I supposed to produce, secrete, like hormones, like super specialized roles without the benefit of having pre-existing eyes, right? Like, biological systems bootstrap themselves. And think about like the existence of cancer, right? Like, cancer is of course much more common in older organisms, but oh my god, like, you have like an example where a subset of the organism kind of like perceives itself as a different entity, right? Like, and is able to segment itself out and like scavenge resources and multiply and eventually, conquer and kill the organism, not by intention, but just because of, replicator dynamics. What is going on there, right? So you have a situation where you're trying to coordinate so many little like cells and trying to make them act as one, where you have this crazy, crazy situation where, you know if any subset within that entire system kind of like manages to perceive itself and harmonize itself um, and experience the rest, of the organism as an other to go against and parasitize, then the organism, gets destroyed and just doesn't survive, right? In other words, it is not like, let's say, a computer virus where, okay, there's like a few key bottlenecks. Like, few is like, okay, you may infect the cache, or do a cache overflow operation. You may be able to do a memory hack or something like that. No, biological systems are way crazier, right? Because let's say this is like the entire organism. The cancer could be here, or the cancer could be this object, or the cancer could be like this whole thing, or it could be like multiple of these at once, right? So like, as the organism grows, you need to, it's not a matter of kind of like unifying all of the cells just into kind of like a bundle. You want to ensure that every possible partition within the organism chooses to cooperate with the whole. And this is a combinatorial explosion, right? There's a massive number of ways in which the organism could actually segment itself, right? So again, it's not like a simple fractal. It's not like, okay, at this level, these are the modules, period. It's like, no, you have to take into account every possible partition, of which there are just so many, countless possibilities. This like starts to hint at just like the magnitude of the problem. And, what is it that consciousness is actually solving for, right? That you have a system that self-organizes and prevents internal partition defections, and then on top of that is able to create a map of itself, right? Like, your conscious experience is in some sense kind of like routing signals all throughout your body and creating a mini model, not only of your environment, but of yourself, like proprioception and interoception. So how can a system see itself, so to speak, right? it's actually mind-boggling that this is like possible at all. I don't, more so, I don't think we evolved to like know or understand and even the challenges involved in making this happen. Um, but yeah, once you really think about it, you utilize your serial processing capacity to kind of like work through systematically everything that needs to be solved in order to create a biological organism. It's extremely mind-blowing. Mm. Okay, so that already kind of like hints at the type of thing that these like subagent networks or architectures are made of in a sense. Even this is already just slightly better approximation than kind of like bags of bags, is more kind of like a superposition of possible partitions, right? It's like I mean, think of like a high school or like a middle school, I guess, like groupings, right? It's like, okay, like at the level of 3 people, these 3 kids get along very well, let's say. But at the level of like 30 people, well, that whole group gets along very well. Let's say like the band, right? Like, or the chess club or whatever. And maybe, at the level of 3, only one of them is, in the chess club. But that doesn't mean that those 3 aren't, good friends, right? Like there's kind of like the alliances and the groupings might be different depending on the scale, right? Like, so they have this very complex thing that if you want to model mathematically, and I recommend kind of like thinking about this, you start to require something that looks more like a hypergraph rather than just a graph. So you need edges, so to speak, that can bind together many of the nodes all at once. And it's not as simple as kind of like, encoding or representing a graph using kind of like 2 types of nodes, a bipartite graph where the nodes become kind of these hyper edges symbolically, because you require actually in some sense kind of holistic near instantaneous interactions within the groupings. Whereas if you have the bipartite approach, you will have like some time delays. I don't want to get too much into those details, but that is just to say, yes, you need some kind of like hypergraph data structure to start thinking about like, okay, how subagent architectures are put together, in a biological organism. And again, organisms that do work and survive and can reproduce are able to, find the conditions, finally balance them such that no partition is defecting against its complement or against the whole or against other partitions. It's mind-blowing. Now, I will mention though, on the typical person, and I suppose on the typical dog, maybe even on the typical plant, there may be a significant degree of factionalization, where along some partitions you have some enemies, so to speak, some like genuine competition for, let's say, like survival or propagation, but it hangs together such that because you're taking into account like the different scales, that is not actually fatal, right? Like again, like maybe on the middle school, metaphor is like, okay, yeah, sure, like this group of friends and this group of friends, maybe they battle each other out and they hate each other for whatever reason. However, because like 2/3 of both of those groups belong to the chess club, they can't actually kill each other, right? Like, because if they did, the chess club would also break down, and they value enough kind of like the coherence and harmony within the chess club that, these animosities will remain kind of like marginal. Okay, so, and here's the thing, right? Like competition within us is actually very essential for information processing, especially of certain types. Meaning that you have like you need a lot of glue, a lot of ways in which kind of like this combinatorial partitioning makes it all hang together regardless. And I think some of these ideas, Michael Levin, who looks at like bioelectricity and is an amazing researcher with a lot of empirical, data and results. He also kind of like has definitely shown signs of like starting to think along these lines, because, he thinks about, okay, how, within biological organisms, you require a generalization of game theory, right? Because within standard game theory, which for some reason people are very annealed to, people think of it as kind of like, oh yeah, this is the ultimate in how you analyze systems. It's like, no, game theory, standard, classical game theory is extremely deceptive. That is not how reality works, as far as I can tell. Because you have one of the key options is not only, do I cooperate, do I defect, do I do this move or do I do that move? One of the options that you have is, do I merge with the other or not? And in what way? Like, does like 80% of me break away and like, merge with 60% of the quote unquote enemy, and then you have like a different faction. That is an option. That is definitely an option within us, within biology. Um, so you require kind of like a really intense generalization that is conceptually very non-trivial in order to actually make sense of, how game theory applies to biological organisms. And that is like without even considering things such as like ecosystems, like partitions within across individuals, and things such as like considerations about inclusive fitness within a species, which also comes with crazy game theoretical considerations that I think are wildly underestimated, and they're extremely interesting, very very far from obvious. Okay, so that is like costs of embodiment. So we are solving something very complex. We're not just kind of like, hey, putting a memory system here, putting like, an attention system here. We're doing something much more intricate. The next thing that I want to mention, and this is more of an intuition pump, and hopefully will make sense as we go along, is that I think that, kind of like the parasitic sense of self, which is, let's say, like the standard sense of self in modern society and humans, that comes with some kind of hedonic and game theoretical costs, is of the form where something like 60% of kind of like the broadest, largest scale partitioning of the organism is kind of like has the other 40% subjugated. In what way does this manifest? Well, in a lot of ways, even just at the level of perceptual representations, because the normal state of consciousness, in contrast to, for example, the 5-MeO DMT state of consciousness or awakening, as far as I can tell, talking to people who have been able to achieve like fourth path within Buddhist traditions, etc. Very deep levels of realization, people don't have these, but like the average person, I think they do. What happens is that, they're partitioning their field of awareness and field of consciousness into a bucket that they label as them. Their brain kind of like labels as like, this is me, this is my color, this is my shape, this is my vibe. And then, the other 40%, we label it as other. Now, if you think about it more deeply, well, everything that you experience is part of your world simulation. It's part of the same kind of like topological pocket of experience. And so like within it, you're all of it, right? Like the fact that you're kind of like taking an object and you represent it as like something external, there's some level of internal defection that is going on, even if it's just for representational purposes. Whereas, let's say kind of like an awakened state of consciousness, so to speak, is one where you realize that everything that you experience is kind of like part of a holodeck. It's part of a holographic simulation where, here and there are like interdependent, and they're actually part of the same thing. They're kind of like part of the same path integral that like covers the entire experience. And you don't have this artificial partition where you can actually get the feeling of like, oh, I'm gonna, I can push away this, I can reject this, even, if you've cultivated kind of like aggressive tendencies and habitual patterns, even to the point of like, generating like sophisticated subagents with those tendencies, they are actually kind of like using discordant, dissonant, piercing patterns against other regions of the hologram, which is unpleasant, right? Like, obviously, right? Like if you're kind of like twisting yourself and like using, claws in order to kind of like fight yourself, that is kind of like what an object like this, right? It's like it's fighting itself, believing that is like fighting something else. Now, again, it's a little bit more subtle because there is a sense in which there is a partition, but it's more kind of like a functional partition rather than an ontological partition. And of course, if you zoom out even further, there's a case to be made that, awareness itself is our ultimate true identity, in which case any partition is illusory. However, within the QRI paradigm, within this video, the way I think like moments of experience are in some sense like significant natural partitions, and those have to be taken into account into any kind of like Mereological analysis of the world. Okay, so the sense of self, it's kind of like this situation. The body, the world simulation figured out how to kind of like partition 60% versus 40%. And very dualistic mindsets, and cultures and kind of like states of consciousness, they do this fractally. Again, not in a perfect self-similar way, but like approximately. We're kind of like at each level, there's like a region that is kind of like dominating and taking control over the, 60% is kind of like subjugating the other 40. That's very unpleasant. Once you kind of like integrate all of the ways in which the organism is fighting itself, that is actually quite unpleasant. And there's just better ways. There might be some computational trade-offs. I admit fighting yourself does something potentially computationally distinct, but I do think there's ways around it. I haven't seen kind of like a fundamental computational deficit in people who are like awakened, so to speak. My sense is that there are workarounds, right? Like this is just the infighting kind of like principle is just kind of the lazy local maxima for how to get some competitions going, something that we found when we were like very small children. But my bet is that there are just much better ways of doing this. Okay, I'm gonna reward one of my subagents with the lilac fragrance oil. Yeah, okay, awesome. Yeah, let's keep going. um, hmm. Okay, so the next thing I'm gonna say is um, remember, I've talked a lot about this, which is like what kind of object a moment of experience is. And it's like something for which we don't yet have conventional words. Again, because the standard Mereology of public language and communication between humans is kind of set theoretic, where like we define objects and then we define parts of those objects, and then we kind of like treat the object as just kind of the sum of the parts. Whereas in fact, there's a lot of holistic properties, right? Like even within a standard metal, from a physics perspective, you have delocalized electrons. There's kind of like a wave of electrons, even, like to conduct electricity. This is like a super ubiquitous thing. You have kind of like, hey, the electrons are confusing with each other. They don't know which one they are. And in fact, it might be kind of like mathematically undefined, right? So, so we are like a certain type of thing that has many pieces of information and yet is one. Is this like inconceivable, superposition of unity and multiplicity. And I really want you to think about this because honestly, like most people, the way they relate to their experience and how they conceptualize consciousness, they do think about it in a very set theoretic way, right? Like they partition their field of consciousness and they say like, okay, like there's object segmentation, and within each of those objects, there's like parts and so on, without kind of like being able to reflect on their whole experience and realize, holy crap, this is a whole thing. It's a whole thing all at once, but it's also, from another perspective, it's a bunch of different parts. It's both. It's both simultaneously. We don't have words for things that are like that. And this is a strong thing. This is not kind of like a weak, it kind of is like this. Like, no, I think this is ontologically the case. Reality turns out to be the sort of thing that can enable and accommodate the superposition of unity and multiplicity, right? So now, once you kind of like realize that, you can understand that within a given experience there can be multiple perspectives, and those perspectives, they're in some sense different, but in some sense they're different facets of the same thing. The concept of a facet. Like the facet of a jewel is kind of like the various like sides of a jewel. A jewel, or like a diamond, let's say, with a lot of facets and like some total internal reflection from certain angles, that's actually starting to become like a good metaphor for the sort of thing that we are. Because once you kind of like take into account all of the possible paths for the light inside it, and you look at, okay, what is the emergent standing wave pattern? There's like an Indra's net quality to it, right? Like there is, every facet is reflecting every other facet. It's kind of like an infinite recursion sort of thing, but nonetheless, physically speaking, it does converge, on a stable equilibrium, and it's okay. Like this is, once you take into account the diffraction limit, for example, like, yeah, adding more iterations just doesn't change like what the standing wave pattern might be, at the deepest of levels. And so it converges, and it converges on this thing that is kind of like everything is reflecting everything else, and yet it's just one object, right? So facets, think of your subagents on a given moment of experience as facets of you. modulo some complications that I'm gonna get to later, which make this even way more trippy and complicated. But again, baby steps. We already kind of like covered. Hey, it's not a fractal in the conventional sense. It's not set theoretical in a conventional sense. You need at least hypergraphs, and now these are kind of like facets of an infinitely reflecting Indra's net, so to speak. Now, the next insight here for how to think about subagents is that um, they're kind of like operators. I mean, in fact, if you think of the subagents as different facets, different perspectives or points of view within your moment of experience, now in most experiences, we actually evolved and learned to kind of like try to overlap them as much as possible. And in fact, the thing that is part of the kind of like consilience algorithm is the perspectives try to reach the same information content and harmonize. They don't always can. But it's, if you're experiencing a lot of internal conflict and tension and so on, it might very well be because like the perspectives are not able to come to a consensus on what is true, what is reality. When there's like a very tricky, social situation or like a very difficult puzzle, things like that may happen. But they coexist, right? Like they're kind of invisible because usually they converge. They become kind of like more obviously distinct when they can't converge, where the problem is impossible or is very difficult, requires like a very complex search process. But the key thing is what all of the perspectives are trying to do in some sense is minimize the energy of the system. At the fundamental level, that is one of the key things, if not the key thing that we're always trying to do. We're trying to minimize our energy for physical reasons, and out of which kind of like the valence gradients emerge. But in some senses, like you think of like an object that is kind of like very chaotic, unstable. If you analyze it from a certain perspective, you may realize, oh my gosh, I could kind of like flip it over and then it's going to stabilize. But then you look at it from a different perspective and you realize, I could probably just like lift the center and it will also stabilize. Okay, so think of the different subagents inside you as these different perspectives that have different opinions on how to stabilize the object. And oftentimes, that stabilization is mutually incompatible. So it's like, hey, like either you do this operation and then it becomes like more stable, or you do this other one, but you can't do both. Now, in other conditions, in other situations, actually, doing the operations that they suggest leads to the same place. In fact, that might be, for example, when you do a lot of jhana meditation or even loving kindness meditation that I'm going to explain a little bit further later, how these interact with subagents. But yeah, in some sense, kind of what you're doing is you're stabilizing the system in a coherent way. Like pointing towards kind of like the same jhana from different perspectives will take you to the same place. That is a very kind of like coherent attractor, is one way of minimizing the energy of the system, where the subagents are kind of like able to cooperate. Now, it actually may be very difficult because the place from which you start may require a lot of kind of like hill climbing so that you can eventually then descend into things like the jhanas, because the perspectives may not align at first. But over time, eventually the subagents agree, and they're doing the same operation all across the board. Okay, so that was another important thing. Another important perspective is that biologically, you can think of kind of like a key aspect of the substrate of this subagent architecture is different physiological needs, right? Like if you stop breathing, right? If you hold your breath, within a matter of minutes, you're gonna feel a lot of negative valence, right? Like drowning, not being able to breathe is very unpleasant, especially if you haven't trained for it and you don't have the equanimity around it. It's just very unpleasant, and that is kind of like you're breaking a need, something that every aspect of your body needs. Like all of your cells are eventually gonna die if you're not breathing. So the organism is going to be very, coordinated around that goal. Now, on the other hand, if you take kind of like a status hit on your chess, club, but you realize that kind of like becoming, flustered about it would cause a status hit to your partner, a different thing, or you might embarrass your family. Okay, when you have a situation like that, hey, like this move over here maybe deprives this whole subagent network from like necessary dopamine, which is, let's say, like what keeps it having some influence on the rest of the network. And eventually that cashes out into, let's say, like less glucose. So hey, that coalition of neurons are going like, hey, don't do that, and this other coalition is like, hey, don't do that. And in both cases it's like, hey, there is something at stake, kind of like the glucose eventually, or like the other key currencies, neurotransmitters, vibrations, integration, oxygen, any of those at any level of organization in any of the partitions, may cause kind of like the, in some sense, yeah, kind of the self-organization towards a common goal for the different partitions. And that's like one important way of thinking about it, that like we evolved in such a way that the different parts that are functionally distinct, that have like different, you can factorize the organism into the different kind of like loadings of different needs for different parts. Your liver needs something else than your stomach, which needs something else than your heart. uh, they all evolved to be able to send signals of distress that will compel the rest of the organism to mobilize resources in order to, actually give it what it needs. And it does, the organism needs to do this. And again, because they are kind of in competition on some level, um, not in others, but on some level they are in competition. They do require kind of like carrots and sticks. Like your liver has to be able to kind of like, in some way, kind of like threaten the rest of the body and say, hey, if you don't give me what I need, you're gonna die, and you're gonna suffer on the way. And negative valence is related to this, as well as positive valence. Positive valence is more generically, you can think of it as kind of like the signature of agreement between the subagents, which happens through, phase locking, harmony, integer ratios of vibrations, like coherence. Great. That's like energy efficient. It's beneficial on multiple levels. Now, why would the body like, evolve to produce dissonance? Anxiety, pain, depression, they shorten your life, right? Like, when a mouse is kind of like running away from a tiger, does that happen? No, a cat. Let's say, to move around is getting really stressed, right? Like, and that stress comes from like, a world model that contains subagents with prediction capacities, and the subagents are anticipating, um, hey, in my predictions, in my simulation, if this happens, I'm gonna lose resources. And then it uses like carrots and sticks on other subagents through a network of kind of like coordination, until, hey, like the organism is actually stressed whenever it thinks of getting closer, let's say, to the tiger or to the cat. In other words, the organism hurts itself in order to prevent it from hurting itself even further through a process of inaction. Now, this can be very faulty. Nowadays, signals of danger and, anger and fear, applied to, for example, am I filling out my taxes right, or something like that. Like, the stress may actually get in the way of proper performance, to reduce the actual risk. So yeah, we didn't evolve for our society in particular, but of course, yeah, like systems fail in all sorts of catastrophic ways. But yes, to a first approximation, organisms that survive, that are good at reproducing in biological, ecosystems, are precisely those that figure out how to hurt themselves, in a way that compels action, or hurt of other subsystems hurting each other in a way that compels action, in such a way that the expected value of doing that is kind of like a net reduction of, future expected harm. Truly is more kind of like, net reduction of inclusive fitness, propagation of those genes that are responsible for those programs, etc. But again, like, the whole thing is very complex, and very, 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 very complex, because there's many ways of doing this. And the strategies may depend on the scale, and may depend on how many systems are coordinating with each other, and also on what are the phenomenal boundaries within the organism. So again, yeah, it's important to kind of like be, epistemologically optimistic, but yeah, like humble about the complexity of subagent dynamics. Actually, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that people want to sell subagent dynamics as something simple, because it's just so complex, right? That like, if you want to actually kind of like get some mileage and produce like a therapy or something, you need to focus on some level first. My reading is like, let's say like internal family systems is like, hey, they're not looking at the level like organs and cells or like, hypergraph partitionings or things like that. They're looking at kind of like functional partitions, uh, that allow you to kind of like, okay, integrate some of those levels better with kind of like the whole. But again, it's going to be very partial. It's not going to be the whole thing. And therefore, more crazy subagents might figure out how to actually hack those systems. Even if you're very well integrated with internal family systems, there might be other funky things going under the surface that are just very difficult to put into words. But hence this effort. Okay, so carrying on. Okay, so I've talked about this in the past, just like very quick recap. This is like kind of like going a little bit towards an explanation of like what I think the key difference is between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. But I think this is actually much more universal. So what I'm going to show you right now is building towards what I call and QRI has roughly been thinking about this for a good number of years, which is like a periodic table of self-organizing principles. Effectively, if you think of the body as, okay, physical systems that use self-organizing principles, such as like coupling dynamics, okay, you can approximate a lot of the body, a lot of what's happening in terms of systems of coupled oscillators. Then within kind of like that paradigm, there are ways in which you can kind of like reason about emergent dynamics that allow you to kind of have like, a periodic table of those like different possible systems of self-organization. And now I don't want to kind of like oversell it, because it's not going to be something like chemistry. At the end of the day, it's not going to be like, hey, there's like these 50 different self-organizing principles and everything emerges out of that. No, because there's also going to be things that are like scale specific or like medium specific, substrate specific. And it even, in the most optimistic of cases, there's going to be a lot of corner cases and a lot of like edge cases where you need a much more sophisticated theory that I'm not even like, gonna get into at this point. But, a lot of what we want is kind of like this concept of, explanatory power, right? It's like simple things that explain a lot. And what I'm going to describe does that, I believe. I'm currently gathering evidence, running studies in this direction. So if you think of a system of coupled oscillators that, let's say, is like a line of, like metronomes, all of those are kind of like, they want to do tick tock, tick tock, tick tock at a certain frequency. Each of those maybe have like slightly different natural frequencies. This one is like 10 hertz, this one is 9, this one is 11, 10, 12, and so on. And they're connected to their neighbors, right? So if you have only 10 of those, and you can run simulations on this. In fact, we have some of those simulations at QRI. If you look up, like models of cessation at QRI.org, you will get to some of those. If, you have a line of those oscillators that everybody's just connected to their neighbors, usually what you will see is that, okay, they start kind of like at different frequencies, but if the coupling constant is like sufficiently high, eventually they're all actually synchronized. They're all going to be like moving in the same phase. They're interlocked with each other. Now, what happens if you keep extending this line, right? Like if you keep going and you keep going, you have like 10,000 of these nodes. You get to a point where like they never synchronize. In fact, you may have kind of like traveling waves of synchrony. It's like, hey, there's like maybe like 3 of those are in synchrony and they're like, that's moving around. Or you may have kind of like spontaneous synchrony in some regions and then it disappears. Kind of like, virtual particles. Like, okay, a little bit of synchrony, it goes away. Okay, now if you start adding connections, further connections, kind of like connecting the system, making it more interconnected, such that, let's say, like this one now wants to also couple to this one and to this one. Now, what starts to happen is that there's going to be 2 key phase transitions. Eventually the network is going to be kind of, like this 2-dimensional mess or 3-dimensional mess or something like that. So forget it. Eventually it's just not going to be a line in a sense because you're adding extra connections. There's going to be 2 phase transitions. First, you might have what I call competing clusters of coherence. And that is where like, oh, this is kind of ugly, but like, you get what I mean? Like there's going to be like regions where the network is internally coherent, but it's not, there's no global coherence, right? Like not all of the oscillators are all phase locked. But then if you keep adding more connections, you're going to cross a threshold where you go from competing clusters of coherence to just like global coherence. The whole thing is actually synchronized. Okay, so what I want you to think about is that a lot of what we are, in some sense, um, might very well be like networks that are like finely tuned to be at the edge between these two, phases. So, for example, attention. In my model of attention, something that came up from like jhana retreats and thinking about this very deeply, uh, I might think of, for example, the frontal lobes, in a sense, are kind of like they're taking care of the logic of attention. By default, they're connected just enough to have these competing clusters of coherence, and not enough to have just like one global coherence. Now, if you do a lot of jhana meditation and you keep kind of like focusing on you're trying to unify attention and you try to unify sensations and you do it over and over, it's almost kind of like you're adding like a shared wave all across the board. And eventually you synchronize, let's say, your sensory modules, and that synchrony boosts enough the interconnectivity and the coherence of your frontal lobes that then zoom, okay, finally they actually are able to kind of like laser focus, and then you enter a jhana. Does this make sense? Right? Like what we want is kind of like subsystems that are kind of like being able to toggle between the full coherence and the partitioned state. Now, interestingly, right, like this is kind of again, kind of like Michael Levin's broad idea, or like the generalization of game theory that we were talking about. Is like, okay, like in one state they're separated, in a different state they're unified, and so the option of unifying is there, which changes the game theory quite a lot, and it actually incentivizes the organism to act as a unit. So that is like one of the key self-organizing principles within this whole kind of like paradigm of like a periodic table of self-organizing principles to explain neural architectures, valence gradients, etc. Another one is symmetric versus asymmetric mappings in systems of coupled oscillators. So this is also something that we have online. Let's say you have like a grid of oscillators. I'm not going to draw all the lines, but you get the idea. We have like a grid of oscillators here, a grid of oscillators here as well. So something that you can do is like, okay, everybody here is connected to their neighbors, to immediate neighbors, okay? But let's say like you also add kind of these like jump connections, right? Like everybody is not only connected to their neighbors, they're also like mapped to this other grid. One way of thinking about this is actually think of it as kind of like layers. You have like one layer here, and everybody kind of like maps onto like along the vertical axis as well. Of course, you can make a cube if you keep stacking. Very simple concept. Okay, so there are fundamentally two very different things that you can do here. So one is you can make all of these connections positive in both directions, meaning that it's kind of like, hey, this whole layer over here wants to be the same as this whole layer over here. Now, if the parameters of the oscillators are close enough, actually, in both of these layers, they may converge, right? And this is a good metaphor for like, vibing with somebody. Hey, let's say like I'm a little bit tipsy and you are drunk or a little bit drunker. Maybe we're like close enough that we can vibe together, right? Like the waves between us are able to kind of actually synchronize. But if you're like totally wasted and I'm just a little bit tipsy, or like I'm high on weed or whatever, even if we try to kind of like make sense of each other and coordinate, maybe we can't, right? Like it won't go through. Okay, so I'm gonna cut it here. This is just gonna be like part one. I'm gonna do part two